Senior U.S. correspondent Mike Wagenheim in New York. Good evening, Mike. Time was running out. Even U.S. Secretary of State said so a while ago regarding nuclear talks. What's the plan in Washington?
Well, it's twofold right now, but in the end, it's really in Iran's court. In terms of the American plan, everybody has said, from Secretary of State Tony Blinken to Special Envoy for Iran Rob Malley to President Biden himself, that diplomacy is the preferred avenue, that they'll continue talks with the Iranians as long as the Iranians are willing to engage in good faith negotiations. But what it really means is this: there's no clock running down for the Americans. They're not going to say, well, you have a week, you have a month, you have this, you have that. It really is up to the Iranians in terms of the progress they're making toward a nuclear weapon. And when it becomes a matter that they've crossed a certain threshold where they can no longer get into that quote-unquote box of parameters that is contained within the JCPOA, well, then effectively at that point time has run out. So the Americans are not setting a deadline. What they've essentially told the Iranians is, if the JCPOA is no longer effective, it's no longer valid, it's no longer relevant because of you, the Iranians, and the developments that you're making on your nuclear program, that's where the negotiations end, and other options might have to be on the table at that point. In the meantime, the Americans working with Israel and other Gulf countries to develop that quote-unquote Plan B.
Okay, I want to bring in Iran expert Meir Javedanfar here in Israel. Good evening to you, Meir. Who's winning so far? The Iranians are winning?
Well, I can tell you, the people of Iran are certainly not winning. The economic situation in Iran is getting worse. Inflation is still high, and unfortunately, life is becoming, every year it's becoming more expensive for Iranians and more difficult. Housing costs. The Iranians, are they winning? It really depends what you describe as winning. To be honest with you, I think the Iranians are under an illusion here. They believe that they're strengthening their hand, and they believe that Rouhani's method did not work. They believe the hardline is in charge, believe that Rouhani trusted the Americans too much. So the best way to get a better deal for Iran is to go to have a stronger hand in the negotiations. And how do you have a stronger hand? By making the Americans wait, by making the Americans sweat, by increasing Iran's influence in the region. The former head of Iran's atomic energy program, Abbasi, said today that, for example, we have to threaten Israel through other proxies, especially Hamas. That way, by putting the other side under pressure, we can get a better deal. And this seems to be the strategy.
Right. So, Mike, here in Israel, there's a lot of nervousness regarding Iran and calls for maybe an attack and so forth. How long will the Americans be able to drag this on before taking any serious action?
Again, I don't think it's so much the Americans that are going to drag things along. If the Iranians put a pause to their nuclear development in terms of the centrifuges, in terms of other research and development, that clock could theoretically run forever. It's again, can the Americans keep the Iranians from crossing certain thresholds in which the JCPOA is no longer valid, that they can't get it back into that so-called box? Once that happens, there's no longer a need for negotiations because there's nothing to negotiate about. So it's not the Americans that are concerned about dragging this thing out. It's really the Iranians that have the control at this point, which is not a good situation to be in. In terms of the Israelis, Benny Gantz is flying to Washington, the Israeli defense minister going to Washington in the coming weeks. He'll certainly meet with his counterparts at the Pentagon, at the State Department, to try to map out, that Plan B and what comes next if the Iranians continue development on their nuclear program and don't come back to the negotiating table in good faith.
And Meir, so far, the Iranians will keep playing on time?
Well, to be honest with you, Yaakov, at the end of November, the Board of Governors of the International Atomic Energy Agency is going to have a meeting, and it is possible that Iran's case, if they decide Iran's not cooperating, that Iran's case is referred to the United Nations Security Council. And at that point, the Chinese and the Russians will be placed in a very uncomfortable spot, which they would rather not be, and that is either to go against the entire West for the sake of Iran, a country which, unlike what the Iranian regime believes, is not that important for China and Russia. Both China and Russia have got bigger fish to fry with the West than Iran. or to take a position with the West. And that's also not so easy for Russia and China because, again, they have their differences. But that could be a watershed moment. I think at that point we could see actually there is a viable possibility that the Chinese and the Russians would say, okay, enough is enough. Okay, Trump made a mistake of walking out of the deal, but it's Iran that's not interested. And there we could have a situation where international community could be against Iran. And when you put that next to the fact that in Israel we have a new administration which believes in working with Americans instead of locking horns, then I think we could have a situation which is ripe for the possibility of either very tough sanctions or possibly military action with international tacit understanding.
Speaking international, Mike, what we're seeing in Glasgow and Rome in the past couple of days, any strategy combined between the U.S. and Europe about Iran?
I think they're of one mind when it comes to going back to the negotiating table and what they want and what they're trying to coax out of the Iranians. I think that is where the agreement ends. I think what to do after that, and it's increasingly looking like there will be, and after that is where there might be a disagreement. Remember, the Europeans have more business ties to Iran, more political ties to Iran. They see this through a different prism. Peace, wonderful. It should be option plan A, B, and C as far as the Europeans are concerned. But what comes after that, I think that is where the U.S. and the Europeans might be of different minds.